In the early hours of a typical morning, you reach for your smartphone to silence the alarm. You check your email, scroll through social news feeds, send a few text messages, and perhaps use a navigation app to avoid traffic on your commute. You swipe your transit card, use your credit card for coffee, walk past security cameras on nearly every block, and settle into your office where you log into your company's network. By the time you have finished your morning routine, you have generated dozens of data points that could potentially be collected, analyzed, and stored by government agencies. The question that haunts our digital age is not whether the government can surveil its citizens, but rather how extensively it does so, what legal frameworks permit or restrict such surveillance, and what this means for the fundamental privacy rights that Americans have long cherished. The revelations by Edward Snowden in 2013 pulled back the curtain on surveillance programs that many citizens didn't know existed, sparking a global conversation about the balance between national security and individual privacy. Yet, more than a decade later, the scope of government surveillance has only expanded, powered by increasingly sophisticated technology and evolving legal interpretations that often favor security over privacy. This investigation into government surveillance examines the tools, techniques, legal authorities, and practical implications of how much the US government really knows about you. The foundation of modern government surveillance rests on a complex web of laws, executive orders, and secret court rulings that have developed over decades. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978, commonly known as FISA, created a secret court system designed to oversee requests for surveillance warrants against foreign spies inside the United States. This legislation emerged from the Church Committee investigations of the 1970s, which revealed extensive abuses by intelligence agencies, including the FBI operations that targeted civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and other political dissidents. FISA was intended to provide judicial oversight while still allowing intelligence agencies to conduct necessary surveillance for national security purposes. The law established the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, or FISC, which operates in secret and hears only the government side when considering warrant applications. For decades, this system operated largely outside public examination, with the FISC approving the vast majority of government surveillance requests. The September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks fundamentally transformed this landscape. In the immediate aftermath, the Bush administration authorized warrantless wiretapping programs that bypassed even the secret FISA court, claiming inherent executive authority to conduct surveillance in defense of the nation. When these programs were eventually revealed, they generated significant controversy, but rather than being shut down, many were instead legalized and expanded through subsequent legislation. The USA Patriot Act, passed just weeks after the September 11 attacks with minimal debate, dramatically expanded government surveillance powers in ways that continue to shape privacy in America today. Section 215 of the Patriot Act became particularly controversial for its authorization of bulk collection of business records, which the NSA interpreted as legal justification for collecting metadata on virtually every phone call made in the United States. This interpretation stretched the law far beyond what most lawmakers believed they had authorized, yet it continued for years before being exposed by Edward Snowden. The metadata collected included the phone numbers of both parties in a call, the time and duration of the call, and location information, but not the content of the conversation themselves. Defenders of the program argued that metadata was not particularly invasive, but privacy advocates pointed out that metadata can reveal extraordinary intimate details about a person's life, including the relationships, medical conditions, religious practices, and political associations. If the government knows that you called an oncology center, then a funeral home, then a life insurance company, they may not know what you said for those conversations, but they know plenty about what's happening in your life. The Patriot Act also expanded the government's ability to conduct sneak and peek searches, where authorities can search your home or business and delay notifying you about the search. It broadened the definition of terrorism in ways that civil liberties advocates warned could be applied to domestic activities, and it reduced judicial oversight for various forms of surveillance. In 2008, Congress passed the FISA Amendments Act, which further expanded government surveillance authority in ways that remain highly relevant today. Section 702 of this law allows the NSA to target non-US persons reasonably believed to be located outside the United States for foreign intelligence purposes without obtaining individual warrants. This might sound limited, but in practice it has enabled vast surveillance programs. Under Section 702, the government doesn't seek warrants for specific individuals. Instead, it gets annual certifications from the FISC to conduct broad categories of surveillance. The NSA then selects selectors, such as email addresses or phone numbers associated with foreign intelligence targets, and directs communications companies to turn over communications to, from, or about these selectors. The problem from a privacy perspective is that these programs inevitably sweep up vast quantities of communications involving Americans. When an American communicates with a foreign target, or when an American is mentioned in communications between foreign targets, that American's communications enter government databases. The NSA refers to this as incidental collection, but the numbers are anything but incidental. Millions of communications involving Americans are collected under Section 702 each year. Even more controversially, FBI agents can search these databases using US person identifiers, conducting what critics call backdoor searches that allow warrantless access to Americans' communications. The FBI has collected millions of these searches, including searches related to domestic criminal investigations that have nothing to do with foreign intelligence or national security. Beyond the legal frameworks that authorize surveillance, the technological capabilities available to intelligence agencies have expanded exponentially in recent decades. The National Security Agency operates a vast infrastructure for collecting electronic communications on a global scale. Documents revealed by Edward Snowden show programs with names like PRISM, Upstream, Mystic, and XKeyscore that collected data in different ways from different sources. PRISM involves collection directly from major internet companies including Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, and others. Though the companies maintain they only provide data in response to lawful government requests, Upstream involves tapping directly into the fiber optic cables that carry internet traffic across continents, allowing the NSA to intercept communications in transit. The scope of this collection is staggering. A single NSA facility in Utah, the massive data repository sometimes called the Spy Center, is estimated to have the capacity to store yottabytes of data, though the actual amount stored remains classified. To put that in perspective, a yottabyte is 1 trillion terabytes, an almost incomprehensibly large amount of information. The facility's existence suggests the NSA's ambition to collect and store vast quantities of communications data, even if current technology doesn't yet allow them to analyze all of it effectively. The NSA's capabilities extend far beyond simply collecting communications. The agency has developed sophisticated tools for breaking encryption, either through mathematical cryptanalysis or by working with technology companies to build backdoors into their products. Documents revealed that the NSA spent hundreds of millions of dollars on the Bull Run program, which sought to defeat encryption through various means, including inserting vulnerabilities into commercial encryption software and standards, obtaining encryption keys through legal or extra-legal means, and using supercomputers to break encryption through brute force when necessary. The revelation that the NSA had worked to weaken encryption standards that protect financial transactions, medical records, and countless other sensitive communications shocked the cybersecurity community. Encryption serves as a fundamental defense not just against government surveillance, but against cybercriminals, foreign intelligence services, and other malicious actors. By deliberately weakening encryption, critics argued the NSA had made everyone less secure in the name of preserving its surveillance capabilities. The agency defended these efforts as necessary for preventing terrorism and gathering foreign intelligence, but the debate highlighted fundamental tensions between security through surveillance and security through strong encryption. The collection of communications content represents just one dimension of government surveillance. Intelligence agencies also collect vast amounts of metadata, which some experts argue provides even more revealing insights than content. The NSA's bulk telephone metadata program, revealed by Snowden and eventually ended in its original form by the USA Freedom Act of 2015, collected records of virtually every phone call made in the United States for years. The agency built vast databases tracking the social networks of millions of Americans, mapping who calls whom, how often, and for how long. This metadata allows sophisticated network analysis that can identify people's associates, predict their behavior, and uncover patterns that might indicate threats or simply reveal intimate details of their private lives. When this program was challenged in court, the government initially claimed it had been essential for counterterrorism, but later reviews found that it had generated little, if any, unique intelligence that couldn't have been obtained through more targeted methods. Nevertheless, while the bulk collection program was nominally ended, the USA Freedom Act created a new system where phone companies retain the records and the government can query them with FISC approval, arguably a distinction without much practical difference for privacy. Meanwhile, similar metadata collection programs continue for Internet communications under different legal authorities. Location data represents another dimension of surveillance that has expanded dramatically with the proliferation of mobile devices. Your smartphone constantly generates location data through GPS, cell tower connections, and Wi-Fi networks. This data is collected by telecommunications companies, app developers, advertisers, and data brokers, and much of it is accessible to government agencies through various means. Law enforcement can obtain historical location data from cell phone companies, often without a warrant, by using court orders under the Stored Communications Act that require less justification than a traditional warrant. The Supreme Court's 2018 decision in Carpenter v. United States established that accessing extended historical cell site location information constitutes a search under the Fourth Amendment and generally requires a warrant, a significant privacy victory. However, the decision left many questions unanswered, including what constitutes extended tracking, whether real-time location tracking requires a warrant, and whether the ruling applies to other forms of location data. Meanwhile, government agencies have found alternative ways to access location data. Immigration and Customs Enforcement and other agencies have purchased location data from commercial data brokers, raising questions about whether the Fourth Amendment can be circumvented simply by buying data on the open market rather than compelling companies to provide it. If the data exists and is for sale, can the government buy it without a warrant, even if they couldn't lawfully compel its production? Courts are beginning to grapple with this question, but current law remains murky and agencies continue to exploit the uncertainty. Facial recognition technology has emerged as one of the most powerful and controversial surveillance tools available to government agencies. The FBI maintains a facial recognition database containing more than 640 million photos drawn from driver's licenses, passport applications, visa applications, mugshots, and other sources. The Department of Homeland Security has access to similar databases and has deployed facial recognition at airports, borders, and other ports of entry. State and local law enforcement agencies increasingly use facial recognition to identify suspects, with some systems allowing real-time surveillance through networks of cameras. The technology works by measuring distinctive features of faces and comparing them against databases to find matches. Modern algorithms have become remarkably accurate under ideal conditions, but they also exhibit troubling biases with significantly higher error rates for people of color, women, and elderly individuals. Studies have found that some facial recognition systems misidentify black women at rates up to 35% higher than white men, raising serious concerns about discriminatory impacts. Beyond accuracy concerns, facial recognition fundamentally changes the nature of public space. In traditional surveillance, someone had to actively watch you and remember your face. With facial recognition, your identity can be automatically logged every time you appear on camera, creating detailed records of your movements through public spaces. Some cities, including San Francisco, Boston, and Portland, have banned or restricted government use of facial recognition in response to these concerns, but many authorities continue to embrace the technology with minimal oversight or regulation. The government's ability to access data held by third parties represents another crucial dimension of modern surveillance. Under the third-party doctrine, established in Supreme Court decisions like United States v. Miller and Smith v. Maryland in the 1970s, individuals generally have no reasonable expectation of privacy in information willingly shared with third parties. This means that emails stored on Google servers, photos uploaded to Facebook, search queries sent to Google, purchase records held by Amazon, and countless other forms of data held by companies can often be accessed by law enforcement without a warrant. The third-party doctrine was developed in an era when people shared relatively little information with third parties, but in today's digital ecosystem, virtually everything we do involves sharing data with corporate intermediaries. We cannot meaningfully participate in modern life without using email, smartphones, social media, cloud storage, and other servers that inevitably share our data with companies. Privacy advocates argue that the third-party doctrine is hopelessly outdated and that constitutional privacy protections must evolve to reflect contemporary realities. The Supreme Court took a small step in this direction with the Carpenter decision, recognizing that cell site location information deserves Fourth Amendment protection despite being held by phone companies, but the broader third-party doctrine remains largely intact. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies make hundreds of thousands of data requests to technology companies each year, and while companies have become more transparent about these requests and sometimes fight over board demands, they generally comply with lawful requests. National security letters represent a particularly powerful and controversial tool for accessing third-party records. NSLs are administrative subpoenas that FBI agents can issue without court approval to obtain certain types of records from companies, including subscriber information, toll billing records, and electronic communication transaction records. The Patriot Act expanded the FBI authority to issue NSLs and initially prohibited recipients from disclosing that they had received an NSL, creating a system of secret surveillance with no judicial oversight. Courts eventually found these gag orders unconstitutional, leading to reforms that allow recipients to challenge both the NSL and the gag order. However, NSLs remain a powerful tool, with the FBI issuing thousands each year. The FBI sent more than 13,000 NSLs in 2020, seeking information on more than 10,000 different accounts. The lack of prior judicial review means NSLs can be issued based only on an FBI agent's assertion that the information is relevant to an authorized investigation, a far lower standard than the probable cause required for a search warrant. While reforms have added some oversight and reporting requirements, NSLs remain a form of surveillance that operates largely outside traditional judicial checks and balances. Surveillance extends beyond communications and location data to financial transactions, which are extensively monitored by government agencies. Banks and financial institutions are required by law to report various types of transactions to the government. The Bank Secrecy Act requires financial institutions to file suspicious activity reports for transactions that might indicate money laundering, tax evasion, or other crimes. Banks filed more than 2.5 million SARs in 2020, creating a massive database for potentially suspicious financial activity. These reports are collected in the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network database, which is accessible to law enforcement agencies for investigations. Additionally, any cash transaction over $10,000 must be reported to the government through currency transaction reports, and attempts to structure transactions to avoid this reporting requirement, even if the underlying activity is legal, can itself be a crime. The government also operates extensive surveillance of international financial transactions through programs like the Terrorist Finance Tracking Program, which monitors transactions processed through the SWIFT International Banking Network. This surveillance has proven valuable for tracking terrorist financing and money laundering, but it also means that the financial privacy has largely disappeared. Every significant transaction you conduct, and many insignificant ones, potentially creates a record accessible to government investigators. The expansion of surveillance has been particularly acute at the nation's borders, which have long been treated as special zones with reduced constitutional protections. The border search exception to the Fourth Amendment allows customs officers to search people and their belongings without a warrant or probable cause. As more of our lives are stored on digital devices, this has created significant privacy concerns. Customs and Border Protection has claimed authority to search smartphones, laptops, and other electronic devices at the border without individualized suspicion, copying the entire contents of devices in some cases. The agency conducted more than 40,000 device searches in 2019 before the COVID-19 pandemic reduced travel. Courts have begun to push back on the most expensive claims, with some rulings requiring reasonable suspicion for forensic searches for devices, but basic searches can still be conducted without any suspicion. The definition of the border has also expanded through the concept of the Border Search Exception Zone, which CBP interprets as extending up to 100 miles from the US border or coastline. Approximately two-thirds of the US population lives within this zone, raising questions about the scope of border-related authorities in areas far from actual borders. While CBP maintains it doesn't conduct routine patrols specifically to exercise border search authority deep within the zone, the legal ambiguity creates space for potential abuse. Biometric data collection represents another expanding frontier of government surveillance. Beyond facial recognition, agencies are collecting iris scans, fingerprints, DNA, and voice prints. The FBI's next-generation identification system contains fingerprints for more than 150 million individuals, along with palm prints, iris scans, and facial recognition data. DNA databases have expanded dramatically, initially containing only samples from convicted felons, but increasingly including samples from arrestees who were never convicted. The federal DNA database contains profiles for more than 20 million individuals. Some states collect DNA from all arrestees, meaning a person could have their genetic information permanently stored in government databases even if they are innocent of any crime. Biometric data is particularly sensitive because, unlike a password or credit card number, you cannot change your fingerprints or DNA if they are compromised. Once collected, this data exists permanently in government databases with few restrictions on how it might be used in the future. The rapid advancement of genetic science raises additional concerns, as DNA contains vastly more information than simple identity. It reveals information about ancestry, disease susceptibility, and potentially even behavioral tendencies. As our understanding of genetics advances, the DNA samples collected today could yield far more information in the future than was anticipated when they were collected. The proliferation of connected devices in the Internet of Things has created new surveillance possibilities that intelligence agencies are actively exploring. Smart home devices like Amazon Echo and Google Home with their always listening microphones, smart TVs with cameras and microphones, fitness trackers that monitor your physical activity and location, smart thermostats that know when you are at home, connected cars that track your every move, and countless other devices all collect data that could potentially be accessed by government agencies. WikiLeaks' 2017 release of CIA documents revealed that the agency had developed capabilities to hack into these tools, like smart TVs, to use them as listening devices, even when they appeared to be turned off. While these tools were reportedly designed for targeted surveillance of specific intelligence targets, their existence demonstrates that intelligence agencies are actively developing capabilities to exploit connected devices. The legal framework for accessing data from these devices remains unclear. Does the government need a warrant to obtain recordings from your smart speaker? What about data from your fitness tracker or smart thermostat? Courts are only beginning to grapple with these questions, and in the meantime, agencies are developing capabilities to exploit any technical vulnerabilities they discover. Social media surveillance represents another dimension of how government agencies monitor the population. Law enforcement and intelligence agencies routinely monitor public social media posts, often using sophisticated tools from companies like Geopedia, Dataminer, and Clearview, AI that aggregate and analyze social media data at scale. These tools can track hashtags, identify people at protests, analyze social networks, and conduct facial recognition on photos. Immigration and Customs Enforcement has monitored social media to identify undocumented immigrants and track activist organizations. Police departments have used social media surveillance to monitor Black Lives Matter protests and other political demonstrations. While monitoring public posts might seem less invasive than accessing private communications, it still raises significant concerns. The aggregation of public information at scale can reveal patterns and details that would not be apparent from viewing individual posts. Moreover, people often don't realize how much personal information they reveal through social media, or how that information can be compiled and analyzed. The use of social media surveillance to monitor political protests raises First Amendment concerns, as people might refrain from exercising their rights to free speech and assembly if they know the government is watching and recording. Some cities have adopted policies restricting law enforcement use of social media surveillance, but many agencies continue to employ these tools with minimal oversight. Artificial intelligence and machine learning have dramatically enhanced the government's ability to analyze the vast quantities of data collected through various surveillance programs. The NSA's X-Keyscore system, revealed by Snowden, allows analysts to acquire and query databases of internet activity using sophisticated search tools, essentially providing a Google-like search engine for surveillance data. Machine learning algorithms can identify patterns in data that human analysts might miss, predict future behavior, and flag individuals for closer analysis. The CIA's interest in data mining and predictive analytics has been well documented, with the agency investing heavily in technology companies through its venture capital arm, In-Q-Tel. Predictive policing algorithms used by many law enforcement agencies analyze historical crime data to predict where crimes are likely to occur and sometimes who is likely to commit them. These systems have been criticized for reinforcing existing biases in policing, as they inevitably reflect patterns in historical police activity rather than actual crime rates. If police have historically over-policed minority neighborhoods, predictive algorithms trained on that data will direct more police to those neighborhoods, creating a self-fulfilling cycle. The use of AI in surveillance also raises concerns about accountability and transparency, as the algorithms used are often exclusive and operate as black boxes that even their operators don't fully understand. How can someone challenge a surveillance decision made by an algorithm if they don't know how the algorithm works or what data it considered? The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which oversees much government surveillance, operates in ways that fundamentally lack the adversarial process central to American justice. The court hears only the government's arguments, with no advocate present to argue for privacy interests or challenge the government's legal theories. This has led the court to approve expansive interpretations of surveillance laws that might not survive approval in traditional courts with both sides represented. FISC opinions are classified, so the legal precedents established often remain secret even from the defendants whose communications are being surveilled. Occasionally, heavily redacted opinions are released, providing glimpses into the court's reasoning, but much of the jurisprudence remains hidden. The court's approval rate for government surveillance applications is extraordinarily high, typically above 99%, leading critics to question whether it provides meaningful oversight or simply rubber stamps government requests. Defenders of the court argue that the high approval rate reflects careful preparation by the government, which typically only submits applications it believes it will be approved, and that the court doesn't push back, leading the government to modify or withdraw some requests. However, without transparency about what the court approves, rejects, or questions, it is difficult to assess how effectively it protects privacy rights. Recent reforms have included provisions for appointing amici curiae, or friends of the court, to argue the privacy side in significant cases, but these advocates appear rarely and their impact remains limited. State and local law enforcement agencies conduct their own surveillance using a variety of tools that sometimes rival those of federal agencies. Automatic license plate readers, deployed on police vehicles and fixed locations, photograph license plates and use character recognition software to identify them, creating databases of vehicle movements. Some law enforcement agencies have collected billions of license plate records, allowing them to track the movements of vehicles across entire regions over extended periods. Stingray devices, also known as cell site simulators or IMSI catchers, impersonate cell towers to force nearby phones to connect, allowing police to identify phones in a given area, track their movements, and in some cases intercept communications. Law enforcement agencies across the country use Stingrays, often without warrants and sometimes without even disclosing their use to courts. These devices don't just affect targeted suspects, they force all nearby phones to connect, collecting information about innocent people as well. Police body cameras and dashboard cameras, deployed with the laudable goal of increasing accountability, also create vast archives of video footage that increasingly is subject to facial recognition analysis. Drones provide aerial surveillance capabilities that were once limited to major police departments with helicopter budgets, allowing even small agencies to conduct extensive aerial monitoring. The proliferation of surveillance tools at the state and local level has created a patchwork of policies and practices, with some jurisdictions imposing meaningful restrictions while others allow largely unfettered surveillance. Private surveillance by corporation creates vast data streams that government agencies can tap through legal requests, purchases, or hacking. The surveillance capitalism business model means that companies collect extraordinarily detailed information about our lives to sell targeted advertising. Google knows what you search for, where you go, what videos you watch, and what you write in emails. Facebook knows your social network, your interests, and through tracking pixels embedded across the internet, much of your web browsing activity. Amazon knows what you buy, read, and watch. Data brokers compile information from thousands of sources to create detailed profiles used for marketing, insurance, lending decisions, and increasingly, law enforcement. This private surveillance infrastructure exists primarily for commercial purposes, but it is available to the government through various means. Companies receive hundreds of thousands of law enforcement requests for user data each year. Some resist overboard requests, but most comply when presented with legal processes. The government also purchases data from brokers, sidestepping questions about whether a warrant will be required to compel to the same information. The line between public and private surveillance has blurred to the point where they function as one integrated system, with private companies doing the collection and the government accessing the results. The national security implications of surveillance are often invoked to justify programs that would otherwise be controversial or illegal. After 11 September, the threat of terrorism became the primary justification for expanded surveillance, with officials arguing that preventing attacks required access to vast amounts of communications data to identify threats before they materialized. This collect-all philosophy, articulated by NSA officials, led to bulk collection programs designed to capture as much data as possible in case it might prove useful for intelligence analysis. However, reviews of these programs have found limited evidence of their effectiveness. The Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board's examination of the phone metadata program found that it was not essential to prevent attacks, and that the information contributed to terrorist investigations by the program obtained through bulk collection could readily have been obtained in a timely manner using conventional targeted methods. Similarly, studies of Section 702 surveillance have found that while it produces valuable foreign intelligence, many of the program's most significant successes involved targeted collection that didn't require bulk surveillance authorities. This raises fundamental questions about proportionality. When people know or believe they are being watched, they modify their behavior, a phenomenon well documented in psychology and sociology. Studies have found that awareness of surveillance causes people to self-censor. Avoiding controversial topics or associations even when discussing them would be illegal. Journalists may be less willing to communicate with confidential sources if they believe their communications are monitored. Activists may be less willing to organize or participate in protests if they fear being identified and catalogued by facial recognition or social media surveillance. Lawyers may have difficulty maintaining attorney-client privilege if they cannot assure clients that their communications are confidential. Doctors and therapists may find patients reluctant to share sensitive information necessary for treatment if they fear it could be accessed by the government. The cumulative effect of this self-censorship across society is difficult to measure, but it represents a real cost to democratic values like free speech, free association, and political participation. A society where everyone knows they might be watched is fundamentally different from one where people can reasonably expect privacy, even if the actual surveillance remains targeted and most people are never directly affected. Reform efforts have sought to rein in surveillance while preserving legitimate intelligence capabilities, but they have achieved only partial success. The USA Freedom Act of 2015 ended the NSA's bulk telephone metadata program in its original form and created a new system where phone companies retain the records and the government can query them with court approval. The law also created modest transparency requirements and provided for the appointment of a MECI in significant FISC cases. However, critics noted that the law left most surveillance authorities intact and legitimized programs by providing clearer legal foundations for them. Subsequent attempts at more comprehensive reform have largely stalled in Congress, with periodic reauthorizations of Section 702 and other authorities passing with minimal changes despite vigorous debates. Some states and localities have been more aggressive in regulating surveillance technologies, with laws requiring transparency, oversight, and public approval before police departments can acquire certain surveillance tools. However, the patchwork of state and local regulations creates an inconsistent landscape, and local reforms obviously cannot address federal surveillance programs. Civil liberties organizations continue to challenge surveillance practices in court, achieving occasional victories like the Carpenter decision, but courts have generally been reluctant to impose sweeping restrictions on surveillance practices, particularly when national security is invoked. The fundamental challenge is that surveillance expansion has been driven by technological capabilities and political demands for security, while privacy protections rely on legal and policy constraints that consistently lag behind technological change. Encryption represents both a privacy protection and a source of ongoing conflict between civil liberties advocates and law enforcement. Strong encryption can protect communications from surveillance by making them mathematically difficult or impossible to intercept and decode. Privacy advocates and cybersecurity experts argue that strong encryption is essential for protecting not just privacy, but also cybersecurity and economic security in an interconnected world. Law enforcement and intelligence officials counter that warrant-proof encryption allows criminals and terrorists to go dark, hiding their communications from lawful surveillance even when courts have authorized access. This debate has recurred periodically, most recently in the fight over encryption in Apple iPhones after the FBI sought to compel Apple to create a backdoor to unlock the phone of a terrorist. Apple refused, arguing that creating such a backdoor would fundamentally weaken security for all users. The case became moot when the FBI found an alternative way to access the phone, but the underlying conflict remains unresolved. Proposals for keyscrew systems, where encryption keys would be held by third parties and available to law enforcement with a warrant, or for responsible encryption that would allow lawful access while maintaining security, have been repeatedly proposed and rejected as technically unworkable or too dangerous. The consensus among cryptographers and cybersecurity experts is that you cannot create backdoors for law enforcement without creating vulnerabilities that can be exploited by malicious actors as well. Yet, law enforcement continues to press for access to encrypted communications, and the debate will likely intensify as encryption becomes more widespread. International cooperation on surveillance raises its own set of concerns and questions. Intelligence agencies routinely share information with foreign partners through arrangements like the Five Eyes Alliance among the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. This cooperation allows agencies to pool resources and access, but it also creates opportunities to evade domestic restrictions by having foreign partners conduct surveillance that would be illegal for domestic agencies and then sharing the results. If the NSA is prohibited from conducting certain surveillance of Americans, but Britain's GCHQ is not, could the agencies agree to spy on each other's citizens and share the intelligence? Officials insist that legal restrictions apply regardless of whether the intelligence is collected directly or obtained from foreign partners, but the opacity of intelligence sharing makes it difficult to verify compliance. Moreover, some countries have far fewer privacy protections than the United States, raising questions about whether American agencies should use intelligence derived from surveillance that would violate US law if conducted here. The global nature of Internet communications means that much American digital communication inevitably traverses foreign networks where it can be intercepted by foreign intelligence services. Understanding what the US government knows about you requires understanding not just American surveillance, but also what foreign partners collect and share. The question of what happens to surveillance data once collected is as important as the collection itself. Data retention policies vary widely across agencies and programs. Some surveillance programs require data to be deleted after a certain period if it is not relevant to investigations, but others allow indefinite retention. The NSA maintains vast databases of communications and metadata, and while there are theoretical limits on how long irrelevant information about Americans can be retained, the practical enforcement of these limits is unclear. Local police departments often retain license plate reader data, facial recognition photos, and other surveillance information indefinitely without clear policies on when it should be deleted. This creates risks not just from government access but from data breaches. The Office of Personnel Management breached compromised security clearance information for more than 20 million people, including extremely sensitive personal information. If the government collects massive amounts of data about citizens, that data becomes a target for hackers, and breaches could expose information that compromises privacy or security. Moreover, data collected for one purpose often ends up being used for completely different purposes, a phenomenon known as mission creep. Data collected for national security purposes has been shared with immigration authorities, leading to deportations. Surveillance tools developed for counterterrorism have been used for ordinary criminal investigations. Once data is collected, there are strong incentives to use it for whatever purposes agencies deem important, regardless of the original justification for collection. The emerging use of artificial intelligence for surveillance raises questions that society has barely begun to grapple with. Predictive algorithms aim to identify threats before they materialize, but they risk creating self-fulfilling prophecies and punishing people for crimes they haven't committed based on statistical patterns. Automated systems make decisions about who to investigate, where to deploy police, and who represents a security threat, often without meaningful human oversight or understanding of how the algorithms reach their conclusions. The use of AI in surveillance also creates risks of bias and discrimination, as algorithms trained on historical data will replicate any biases present in that data. If past surveillance disproportionately targeted minority communities, AI systems trained on that data will continue to target those communities. The opacity of many AI systems means that it is often impossible to challenge their decisions or even understand how they were made. As AI capabilities advance, the power of surveillance grows exponentially, allowing not just collection of information, but automated analysis, prediction, and decision-making at a scale that would be impossible with human analysts. This represents a qualitative change in surveillance, not just a quantitative one, and it demands new frameworks for oversight and accountability that current law doesn't provide. So what does the US government really know about you? The honest answer is that it depends on who you are, what you do, and what has drawn the attention of various agencies. If you have traveled internationally, the government likely has detailed records of your travel, potentially including photographs, fingerprints, and in some cases, full device searches. If you have applied for security clearance, visa, passport, or various government benefits, extensive personal information is on file. If you have been arrested, regardless of whether you were convicted, your fingerprints, photograph, and possibly DNA are permanently stored in government databases. If you use a cell phone, records of who you call and text, and in many cases where you were when you did so, are stored by your carrier and accessible to government agencies through legal process. If you use email, social media, cloud storage, or virtually any internet service, records of your communications and activities are held by companies and can be accessed by law enforcement through various means. If you use credit or debit cards, detailed records of your purchases exist and are accessible to government agencies investigating crimes or national security threats. If you walk down the street in many cities, your face may be captured on surveillance cameras and potentially identified through facial recognition. If you drive, license plate readers may track your vehicle's movements. Beyond specific records, if you communicate with anyone who is a target of foreign intelligence surveillance, your communications may be collected incidentally. Even if you have never been suspected of any crime or investigated for any reason, metadata about your communications, relationships, and activities exists in government and corporate databases and could potentially be accessed through bulk collection programs, database searches, or analytical tools that aggregate information from multiple sources. The scope of this surveillance depends heavily on factors including whether you are a US citizen or permanent resident, which provides more legal protections than if you are a foreign national. Whether you are located in the United States or abroad, as surveillance of people abroad is generally less restricted, whether you have come to the attention of law enforcement or intelligence agencies for any reason, as targeted surveillance is far more intrusive than incidental collection of information about ordinary citizens, whether you use encryption and other privacy-protecting technologies, which can limit, though not eliminate, surveillance, and whether you live in jurisdiction with strong privacy protections or one that allows extensive surveillance with minimal oversight. The reality is that while many Americans are not subject to intensive targeted surveillance, virtually all Americans are subject to some forms of surveillance. And the infrastructure exists to dramatically increase surveillance of any individual if agencies decide to do so. The legal and technical barriers to surveillance have eroded substantially, while agencies' capabilities have expanded dramatically. What can individuals do to protect their privacy in this environment? Complete privacy is impossible in modern society, but informed choices can provide some protection. Using end-to-end encryption for communications through tools like Signal makes it much more difficult for anyone, including the government, to intercept messages' contents. Using a VPN can hide your internet activity from your internet server and make it more difficult to track your browsing. Using privacy-focused browsers and search engines that don't track your activity can reduce corporate data collection. Limiting social media use and being mindful about what you share online reduces the information available for social media surveillance. Using cash for purchases avoids creating electronic records of transactions, though this is an increasingly impractical for any person in many types of purchases. Covering or disabling cameras and microphones on devices when not in use can prevent unauthorized access. Being aware of license plate readers and surveillance cameras can inform decisions about where to go and how to travel, though avoiding them entirely is often impossible in urban areas. However, these measures provide only partial protection and come with significant costs in convenience and functionality. More fundamentally, individual privacy protection measures cannot address the systematic issues of mass surveillance, even if you personally use encryption. If everyone you communicate with doesn't, your communications can be reconstructed from the other side. Even if you avoid social media, others may post about your activity or tag you in photos. Even if you use cash, surveillance cameras may track your movements. Privacy increasingly requires collective action and systematic reform, not just individual choices. The legal protections for privacy have struggled to keep pace with technological change. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, but determining what is unreasonable in the context of digital surveillance has proven challenging for courts. The amendment was written in an era when searches meant physically entering homes or seizing papers, and surveillance meant following someone or listening at their door. Applying these 18th century concepts to 21st century technology requires difficult judgments about reasonable expectations of privacy in contexts the framers could never have imagined. The Supreme Court has struggled with these questions, sometimes expanding privacy protections as in the Carpenter decision and sometimes narrowing them as in the third-party doctrine cases. The result is a complex and often contradictory body of law that provides clear protection in some areas while leaving others exposed. Legal protections like FISA and the Wiretap Act establish procedures for surveillance, but also authorize extensive collection that would have been unimaginable just decades ago. Privacy advocates have called for comprehensive reform that would establish clear rules for digital age surveillance, require warrants based on probable cause for accessing communications content and sensitive data like location and information, prohibit bulk collection programs that sweep up information about people not suspected of wrongdoing, require deletion of information about innocent people, create real oversight mechanisms with transparency and accountability, and establish meaningful consequences for violations. However, political will for such comprehensive reform has been limited, particularly given the political potency of security concerns and terrorism fears. The oversight mechanisms that exist for surveillance have proven inadequate in many respects. Congressional oversight of intelligence agencies is conducted by select committees that operate largely in secret and have often been criticized as too differential to the agencies they supposedly oversee. Members of these committees are briefed on classified programs but cannot discuss them publicly, making it difficult for them to mobilize political pressure for changes even when they believe programs are improper. The executive branch has its own oversight mechanisms, including Inspectors General and the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, but these bodies have limited powers and have sometimes been sidelined when they raised concerns about surveillance practices. The FISC provides judicial oversight, but as discussed, operates without adversarial process and with limited transparency. After the Snowden revelations, when Americans learned about surveillance programs that many members of Congress claimed they hadn't known existed despite being in oversight committees, confidence in the effectiveness of oversight mechanisms was severely shaken. Reforms have attempted to strengthen oversight through increased transparency and reporting requirements, but significant surveillance activities remain classified and outside public examination. The fundamental challenge is that effective oversight of secret surveillance programs requires access to secret information, but the more people who have access to secrets, the less secret they remain. Finding the right balance between secrecy necessary for effective intelligence operations, and transparency necessary for democratic accountability remains an ongoing struggle. The private sector's role in enabling government surveillance has become increasingly visible and controversial. Technology companies are caught between user expectations of privacy and government demands for data. Some companies have taken strong public stance for privacy, implementing encryption that even they cannot break and challenging overboard government requests in court. Others have been more cooperative with government demands, sometimes providing more information than legally required. The business model of most technology companies creates inherent tensions with privacy, as the revenue depends on collecting and analyzing user data for advertising. This creates vast databases that are useful for government surveillance, whether or not that was the company's intent. Data brokers operate largely outside public view, compiling detailed profiles on hundreds of millions of people and selling access to anyone willing to pay, including government agencies. The lack of comprehensive federal privacy legislation in the United States means companies face a patchwork of state laws and have considerable discretion in how they handle user data. Europe's General Data Protection Regulation has created stronger privacy protections that apply to European users of American services, highlighting the gap in American privacy law. Some states have enacted their own privacy laws, but the lack of federal legislation means most Americans have limited legal protections for data held by private companies, which in turn means limited protection against government access to that data. The culture and mindset of intelligence agencies shape how they use surveillance authorities in ways that legal frameworks alone cannot control. Documents released by Snowden and through Freedom of Information Act requests have revealed a culture within intelligence agencies that often pushes boundaries and seeks maximal collection authority. Internal SNA documents described efforts to collect a role, process a role, explore a role, partner a role, sniff a role, and know a role, suggesting an organizational culture that viewed any limitation on collection as a problem to overcome. Agencies have sometimes interpreted their legal authorities in ways that stretched legitimate language far beyond what legislators believed they were authorizing. The bulk telephone metadata program rested on an interpretation of relevant to an authorized investigation that allowed collection of every phone call recorded in America on the theory that they might someday prove relevant. Such expansive interpretations persisted for years before being exposed and challenged. Even when reformers are enacted, agencies often find ways to preserve capabilities through alternative legal authorities or technical means. This pattern suggests that legal restrictions alone are insufficient without cultural changes within agencies and robust external oversight to ensure compliance. However, changing organizational culture in secretive agencies that view their mission as vital to national security and that have historically operated with minimal external accountability is extraordinarily difficult. The partisan political dimensions of surveillance debates have complicated reform efforts. Surveillance powers expanded dramatically under Republican President George W. Bush after 11 September, leading many Democrats to criticize surveillance programs. However, when Democrat Barack Obama took office, many of these programs continued and even expanded, with Obama administration officials defending their necessity for national security. This led some Republicans who had previously supported surveillance powers to become more skeptical, while some Democrats who had criticized surveillance under Bush become more supportive under Obama. Donald Trump's presidency created another shift, with Trump himself criticizing intelligence agencies that he believed he had properly surveilled his campaign, while many Democrats defended those agencies against Trump's attacks. The result has been inconsistent coalitions that shift depending on who holds power, making sustained reform difficult. Civil liberties advocates on both left and right have sought to build bipartisan coalitions for surveillance reform, achieving occasional successes like the USA Freedom Act. But these efforts are constantly undermined by partisan dynamics and the tendency of politicians to support surveillance when their parties control the executive branch and criticize it when the opposition does. This partisan inconsistency has prevented the development of durable political consensus for meaningful limitations on surveillance. International comparisons provide useful context for evaluating American surveillance practices. China has developed the most comprehensive surveillance state in human history, with hundreds of millions of surveillance cameras, mandatory identity tracking, social credit systems that reward and punish citizens based on behavior, and extensive internet censorship and monitoring. Russia conducts extensive surveillance of its citizens with minimal legal restraints, regularly using surveillance powers against political opponents and dissidents. These authoritarian surveillance states demonstrate what becomes possible when technology is deployed without meaningful legal or political constraints. Democratic allies like the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia conduct surveillance comparable to the United States through their intelligence agencies, though with somewhat different legal frameworks. European countries generally have stronger privacy protections enshrined in law, though their intelligence agencies still conduct extensive surveillance for national security purposes. The European Court of Human Rights has established privacy standards that have influenced policy across Europe. Comparing American surveillance to authoritarian states makes it look relatively restrained. Comparing it to the privacy protections in some European democracies makes it look excessive. The relevant question is not whether American surveillance is the worst in the world, but whether it appropriately balances security needs with privacy rights and democratic values. The long-term implications of pervasive surveillance for democratic governance are profound and troubling. Democracy requires space for dissent, for unpopular views to be expressed, for political opposition to organize, and for the press to investigate government wrongdoing. All of these activities become more difficult when participants fear surveillance. History provides numerous examples of surveillance being used to target political opponents, undermine dissent, and consolidate power. While contemporary American surveillance is nominally focused on foreign intelligence and criminal investigation, the infrastructure being built could be repurposed for political surveillance if political circumstances changed. A future administration with authoritarian inclinations would inherit vast surveillance capabilities with insufficient legal restraints. The database researches that the FBI conducts millions of times each year could easily target political opponents. The facial recognition system deployed at protests could identify and catalog dissidents. The social media monitoring tools used to track immigrant activities could track any political movement. The communications databases containing metadata about all Americans could map the social networks of any political organization. The fact that these tools are not being used for wholesale political repression today provides little comfort when considering what could happen in the future. Building surveillance infrastructure on the assumption that it will only be used by well-intentioned officials for legitimate purposes is historically naive. Every expansion of surveillance authority must be evaluated not just based on current uses, but on potential future abuses. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated both the potential benefits and risks of surveillance technologies in new contexts. Contact tracing apps that track location and proximity to other users could theoretically help control disease spread, but they also raise significant privacy concerns. Some countries implemented mandatory surveillance apps that tracked citizens' movements and health status, using the pandemic as justification for surveillance measures that would have been politically impossible before. In the United States, the response was more limited, with most contact tracing apps being voluntary and privacy-preserving by design, but debates raged about whether stronger surveillance measures should be implemented to control the virus. The pandemic also saw increased surveillance of workers through monitoring software that tracked productivity, as many people worked from home, creating new forms of workplace surveillance that may persist even after the pandemic. The crisis demonstrated how quickly surveillance can expand when justified by emergency circumstances, and how difficult it is to roll back surveillance measures once implemented. The temporary becomes permanent, the exceptional becomes routine, and authorities granted for one crisis are repurposed for others. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and the pandemic provided another example of how crisis accelerates surveillance expansion with potentially lasting consequences for privacy. Emerging technologies promise to make surveillance even more pervasive and sophisticated. Artificial intelligence capabilities continue to advance, enabling more sophisticated analysis of surveillance data and potentially automating surveillance decisions. Quantum computing could eventually break current encryption standards, giving intelligence agencies access to communications they currently cannot decrypt. Brain-computer interfaces, while still in early stages, could eventually allow direct monitoring of thoughts, the ultimate surveillance frontier. Advances in DNA analysis could allow prediction of physical characteristics, disease susceptibilities, and potentially behavioral traits from genetic data in government databases. The proliferation of sensors in smart cities, connected vehicles, wearable devices, and countless other contexts will generate exponentially more data about our daily lives. Satellite imagery with resolution sufficient to identify individuals is becoming more common. Advances in audio and video manipulation could make it difficult to determine what is real and what has been fabricated, potentially allowing surveillance data to be manipulated or manufactured. Each of these technological advances creates new surveillance possibilities that current law and policy frameworks are ill-equipped to address. The pace of technological change far exceeds the pace of legal and political adaptation, creating a persistent gap between what is technically impossible and what is legally regulated. The psychological and social impacts of surveillance extend beyond specific privacy violations to affect how we understand ourselves and relate to others. Surveillance changes the relationship between individuals and the state from one between citizens who grant limited power to their government to one between subjects who are monitored and controlled by authority. It shifts power dramatically toward the state and away from individuals as information asymmetry increases. The government knows more and more about citizens, while citizens know less and less about what the government knows and how it uses that information. This undermines the democratic ideal of government accountability to the people. Surveillance also affects social relationships as people become cautious about what they say and do even in private conversations if they believe they might be monitored. Trust erodes when people suspect their communications might be intercepted or their associates might be government informants. The architecture of surveillance, even when not actively used against most people, creates an atmosphere of suspicion and conformity. These effects are difficult to measure empirically, but are no less real for being intangible. They represent a transformation in the nature of society that goes far beyond specific privacy violations to affect the fundamental character of how we live. In conclusion, the question of how much the US government knows about you has no simple answer because it depends on numerous variables, including your status, activities, location, and what has drawn government attention. However, some conclusions are clear. The government has technical capabilities to conduct surveillance on a scale that would have been unimaginable just decades ago. Legal frameworks have generally expanded to authorize collection that would once have been considered unconstitutional. Oversight mechanisms are inadequate to prevent abuse or ensure accountability. The infrastructure being built creates risks not just from current uses but from potential future abuses. Marginalized communities bear disproportionate burdens from surveillance. Technology continues to advance faster than law and policy can adapt, creating persistent gaps in privacy protection. These realities depend on future where it demands serious public discussion about what kind of society we want to live in and what relationship we want between citizens and the state. The question is not just what the government knows about you today, but what it could know tomorrow, how that information might be used, and whether adequate protections exist to prevent abuse. The answers to these questions will shape the nature of American democracy and freedom for generations to come, making surveillance reform one of the most important civil liberties issues for our time. The path forward requires technological literacy among policymakers and the public, political will to impose meaningful constraints on surveillance, legal frameworks that adapt to technological realities, institutional designs that create real accountability, and ongoing public vigilance to prevent the normalization of pervasive surveillance. Without such reforms, the surveillance state will continue to expand, eroding privacy and the democratic values that depend on it.